The following is presented by Community Bible Study, copyright 2025. Psalms, Lesson 24, Praying Amid Opposition, Psalms 62, 64, 86, 94, and 141. Commentary. We can't read Psalms, particularly David's Psalms, without noticing the conflict and opposition. The people we read about in the Bible aren't characters in a made-up story. They were real people with real problems who felt real emotions. In other words, they were a lot like us. 4 of the 5 Psalms in this week's lesson are attributed to David, who was regularly in a battle for his life. We may not face the kind of life-and-death dangers that David did, but no one lives on this earth for long without experiencing some type of opposition. Our enemies may not be coming at us with spears, but we can be attacked in other ways that threaten our physical, emotional, or spiritual security. These Psalms show us how to pray and trust the Lord in the face of such opposition. 1. Psalm 62. Of the many Psalms attributed to David, only a dozen or so make a connection to specific events in his life. Psalm 62 gives no such context, so we can't be sure whom he was writing about. But verses 9 through 10 indicate that the opposition David faced may have come from the wealthy and powerful. His message to them, and to everyone, is that only God is reliable. He alone saves and delivers. The word alone is used 3 times in the first 5 verses, and the same Hebrew word is translated only in Psalm 62, verse 6. David poured out his heart to God because he knew that no one else could save him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. Emphasis added. David didn't look for another person to help him. He didn't even look to himself. Or, if he was writing as king, he didn't look to the army at his disposal. Instead, he said, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence." Emphasis added. Think about a quiet heart posture. David waited in silence, Psalm 62, verse 1, but that doesn't mean he didn't speak. David didn't just resign himself and give up hope that circumstances would ever change. He knew that God wanted to hear what was on his heart. That's why David could be calm and at rest. To wait quietly before God, NLT, is to find rest in God, NIV. And trusting our difficulties and fears to the Lord keeps us from being overtaken by worry. We can wait calmly and confidently, knowing that He will act. Attacked and slandered, David recognized that his security would not be found in people, neither rich nor poor. If you put both low-born people and powerful people on a scale, they'd be so light their weight wouldn't even register. Together they are only a breath, NIV. David also knew that it was foolish to use unscrupulous means to get ahead. In desperate situations, people may resort to desperate measures like theft and extortion. They might think that by having more worldly wealth and power, they could silence the opposition. But David said essentially, don't count on it. What we can count on is the power and justice of God. He is the one who acts on behalf of his people. He will render to a man according to his work, a concept repeated in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 12, and Romans chapter 2, verse 6. God's judgment will come on the wicked, whereas the righteous will receive his favor. As Jesus said, "If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." John chapter 12, verse 26. 2. Psalm 64. In Psalm 64, we again find David opposed by a group of wicked people called the Throng in verse 2, who are plotting against him. Although we don't know who these enemies were or the details of their attack, we do see that David felt trapped and vulnerable. So how did he talk to God amid such threatening circumstances? David registered his complaint with the Lord and asked for 3 things: that God would, 1, hear him. 2, preserve his life. And 3, hide him from his enemies' secret plots. His opponent's weapon of choice seems to have been verbal attacks from those who whet their tongues like swords, who aim bitter words like arrows. Such an attack makes the psalm relatable. Few of us have been ambushed by literal swords and arrows, but most of us have been pierced by people's words. And often the people who hurt us think that God is not watching. But God does see. Psalm 64, verses 7 through 9, shows us that God opposes those who oppose his ways and his people. This part of the psalm uses the same imagery as the opening verses. God's opponents shoot verbal arrows. He, in turn, shoots his arrow at them. They speak bitter, scheming words. He turns their words against them and causes them to be brought to ruin by those words. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35, the Lord said, "Vengeance is mine." And that's what we see here. When he acts, eyewitnesses wag their heads, Psalm 64, verse 8, at those scorned by the Almighty. People won't be able to stop talking or thinking about what the Lord did. When faced with opposition, the righteous can rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. Justice and vengeance belong to God. That's one of the key messages of Psalm 64. This is not a directive to do nothing. It does show us, though, that our first response to opposition should be focused prayer and trust in God's power to rectify every wrong. 3. Psalm 86. When opposition pushes against us, we feel frustrated, stuck, or desperate. Psalm 86 models for us how we can pray in a situation like this and live as people of faith. David reminded himself who he was before God. He recalled who God is and called on God for help because of their covenant relationship. In the first section of this psalm, we see that David considered himself a servant, and 7 times in this psalm he used the Hebrew word Adonai for God, a word that means Lord in the sense of being a master. So David was identifying himself as a servant of the sovereign Lord. Though he was poor and needy, he was also godly. The idea of being godly is translated as being faithful to God or being devoted to him in other translations. See verse 2 in NIV and NLT. David knew he wasn't sinless, but he could call himself godly as a faithful member of God's chosen covenant people. Referring to himself this way also meant he knew that in the day of trouble, the Lord would answer him. David then turned his attention to God's characteristics. Drawing on Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7, David spoke to God about his steadfast love and mercy, his goodness and forgiveness. David reminded himself that he served a God merciful and gracious. Psalm 86, verse 15. Though the insolent men who had risen up against David could have consumed his thinking, he didn't allow them to. Instead, he set his mind on God and the wondrous things he does. This middle section of the psalm affirms God's uniqueness. There is none like you, and his supremacy. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you. Our proper response is to obey, give thanks, and glorify him. This posture of reverent obedience is how we fear God's name. Think about the focus of this prayer. David was in a dire situation. Understandably, he cried out, "Preserve my life," and "Save your servant," Psalm 86, verse 2. But although the prayer of Psalm 86 shows David's need for God's protection, there's more to it than that. David wanted not only to survive, but also to grow. He wanted a deeper relationship with God. He prayed that God would teach him godly ways. David asked, "Unite my heart to fear your name." Likewise, we can pray, "Help me," and "Teach me" at the same time. Both are good responses during times of opposition. With those truths firmly in mind, God's identity and David's identity and relationship with God, David made an appeal in the Psalm's final section. Out of his confidence in God's character, David asked God for strength and favor to face his enemies. He prayed, "Show me a sign of your favor." David wanted other people to see outward signs of God's favor in his life. David knew that God was for him and would deliver him. He wanted other people to know it too. 4. Psalm 94. When we're suffering injustice, it may seem as if God doesn't see what's happening, or worse, as if he doesn't care. Psalm 94 addresses such thinking head on. We can be sure that the Lord sees and hears, and that he will bring judgment against those who oppress the righteous. This psalm begins with a statement about God that we've seen before in this lesson. He is a God of vengeance. We should never forget that although he is loving and merciful, he is also just. He will not let injustice go unpunished. Psalm 94 describes some appalling evil, but the psalmist expressed certainty that God would set things right. The opposition described in this psalm goes far beyond what many of us experience. Arrogant words were only a part of it. The oppressors, who appear to have been in positions of power, murdered the most vulnerable. They condemned the innocent to death. Verse 20 indicates that they even turned their wickedness into law, and they did all of this with arrogant indifference toward the Lord. Psalm 94, verses 8 through 11, speaks directly to the wicked. God knew exactly what they were doing. He didn't just see their actions, he actually knew their thoughts, and they were fools to believe anything else. The psalmist knew this. He was confident that God has the ability and desire, as well as the covenant responsibility, to rescue those who belong to him. For the Lord will not forsake his people. He will not abandon his heritage. Verse 14. In contrast to the senseless rebels, the psalmist saw God's people as teachable. He saw God's discipline and teaching as blessings. The beautiful poetry of Psalm 94, verses 16 through 17, expresses the greatest confidence in times of opposition. Who rises up for me against the wicked? Who stands up for me against evildoers? If the Lord had not been my help, my soul would soon have lived in the land of silence. Those who follow the Lord find that he is their advocate and defender. When they feel weak, they can find rest from days of trouble and know that their all-powerful God is deeply concerned about the injustice they suffer. Followers of Christ find in Psalm 94 a call to endure. God sees what's happening. He's not indifferent or aloof. The powerful people in this psalm sound like the raging, rebellious kings who plotted evil in Psalm 2. Yet that psalm offers the promise of the Lord's anointed, the king in whom the righteous would take refuge. It promises a son with the power to break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Psalm 2, verse 9. This sounds a lot like the wiping out described in Psalm 94, verse 23. God will destroy the evildoers. We now know that this son, this king, is Jesus. The first time he came, he said, "I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world." John chapter 12, verse 47. Yet he also said there would come a day when the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Matthew chapter 16, verse 27. The one who came to save is also the one who will bring justice. 5. Psalm 141. The final psalm in this lesson offers a different perspective on how to think and pray in times of opposition. In Psalm 141, David prayed primarily for his own integrity and growth in godliness as he faced opposition. The psalm teaches that if we are to trust in God instead of ourselves, other people, or what's fair, we must live in close relationship with him. Though Psalm 141 is an individual lament, it's set in the context of public worship. We see this context in verse 2's mention of incense and evening sacrifice. David considered his prayer an act of worship. His desire for holiness is apparent right away. He asked God to protect him from sin and keep him pure in word and deed. He wanted no part in the delicacies of men who work iniquity. This description probably refers to the luxuries enjoyed by people who became wealthy by corrupt means. The center verse, Psalm 141, verse 5, is key to understanding how we can maintain integrity amid opposition. Pursuing godliness is never something we can manage on our own, especially in times of trial. We need other believers to speak truth to us and help us resist sin's temptation. David considered the rebuke of the righteous as a kindness and blessing. He relied on righteous people in the way Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17 describes, "Iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." NIV. Rather than resisting correction from a righteous man, Psalm 141, verse 5, David wanted to receive it and learn from it. It's only after David expressed willingness to accept rebuke from someone who's righteous that he addressed the trouble surrounding him. In Psalm 141, verses 6 through 7, he prayed against the evil deeds of his adversaries, but they were not the main object of his attention. "My eyes are toward you, O God, my Lord," David said next. He then asked God to keep him from falling into the traps and snares his enemies had set for him. David knew that when people sinned against him, he would be tempted to react in a sinful way. David was just as concerned with addressing the evil in his own heart as he was with praying against the evil of his opponents. This is a good example for us to follow. Think about responding to injustice. God cares deeply about the injustice done to us. He also cares about how we respond to it. Another person's wrongdoing can create the kind of trap or snare David wrote about. We may be tempted to take our own revenge. We may feel like saying malicious things about our enemy online or in person. We may even be tempted to make physical threats. When we keep our eyes on God, as David did, and trust Him for justice, we can see the traps for what they are and stay away from them. 6. Conclusions. This lesson's Psalms teach us that in times of opposition, when we feel attacked, persecuted, threatened, or betrayed, we can, 1. Be assured we are not defenseless. God is a refuge, rock, and stronghold for His people. See Psalm 62, verse 2, and verses 6 through 7. We have an answer to the question, who stands up for us against wicked people? It is the Lord. That was the answer for David, and it's the answer for us today. 2. Trust God to bring about justice. We have only limited and fleeting human understanding and efforts, so if we count on people or on ourselves to exact perfect justice, we will be disappointed. People are lighter than a breath. Psalm 62, verse 9. The Lord, on the other hand, though He is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, Psalm 86, verse 15, He is also the one who will repay people according to what they've done. Vengeance is His. 3. Bring our prayers to God. These Psalms show us how to pray in times of trouble. They show us that He wants to hear from us. Again and again, David called out to God, asking Him to hear, answer, save, rescue, guard, and defend. 4. Know that God sees everything. His opponents may think their actions will go unnoticed and unpunished, but that isn't what Scripture says. He who planted the ear, does He not hear? He who formed the eye, does He not see? And He will wipe them out for their wickedness. Psalm 94, verse 9 and verse 23. 5. Focus on maintaining a close relationship with the Lord. Opposition tempts us to sin, threatening to draw our minds off Him and onto our problems. But we can honor God and be obedient and faithful to Him no matter what kind of pressures we face. David left us a clear example of this in Psalm 141. Personalize the truth. How could this week's lesson challenge the way you think about and respond to opposition? This recording has been presented by Community Bible Study. Copyright 2025.